Okay, for our next paper, it's now my privilege to bring to you Mr. Jacob Chabot and his paper, The Vividness of Morality.
The good is a common topic throughout many of the great books. Yet the authors often state that all desires prevent the pursuit of the good, or worse, that the good is not worth pursuing. This paper is about how the existence of a higher good is proven through various characters' pursuit of nobility through desires. First, how Hector, from Homer's Iliad, demonstrates that the pursuit of the good comes from proper motivations. Second, that Penelope, from Homer's Iliad, remains faithful to her husband from a proper love of self. Thirdly, that Patroclus' loyalty to his comrades comes from his love of the absolute good. And finally, the example of Huckleberry Finn shows that the knowledge of the good does not simply come from society, but directly from the good itself. The character Hector demonstrates nobility by being faithful to those who trust him in the face of peril. When his brother Paris provokes an invasion of their country by eloping home with another man's wife, the lower-ranking men of the city go out and fight to prevent the city from being sacked. Paris remains inside the city walls, enjoying luxuries while his countrymen die because of him. Hector, however, joins the soldiers on the battlefield and fights alongside them, eventually dying as the last man outside the gates. Paris outlives Hector, yet Hector is seen as having lived the better life. The reason for this truth is because Hector pursued desires which would lead him toward the good, and put aside those contrary to this aim. Paris's main desire was not for the good, so he ended up chasing desires which led him away from it rather than toward it. A second instance of Hector's nobility is with regards to his wife. Hector has a devoted wife, Andromache, to whom he proves his faithfulness when tempted to be lured away from her by Helen, the woman whom Paris brought home. Helen asks Hector to sit beside her and relax after the battlefield, hoping to entice Hector into pursuing her rather than his wife. But Hector knows Helen's character, as well as his duties toward his wife. He sees through her flatteries and will have nothing to do with her. Don't ask me to sit beside you here, Helen, for I must go home to visit my own dear wife and my baby son. In fighting for the defense of his family and countrymen, Hector pays the tremendous cost of 9 years in constant fear for his life, climaxing in his death. Such a price at first makes little to no sense. Why does he not simply stay within the city gates as Paris does, in safety and comfort, with the companionship of his faithful wife who loves him so much? He would have survived the sacking of Troy. He would have been match enough to keep off the invaders and carry his wife and son to safety. Yet he dies beyond the gates. What makes him choose this course of action? And what about his choices makes his character so esteemed? He is esteemed because he chooses nobility, the pursuit of the good. And he chooses nobility because he is full of good motivations. He understands that any motivation for him to act immorally is ultimately empty, a truth his brother Paris remains unaware of until today. It is not as if Hector cannot act morally unless he has no motivation, for he has many motivations that are good. He has love for his wife and child. He wants to save them. He has desire for the freedom and honor of his city. He desires that his city would stand up against the enemy and prevail over it. Trying to argue that he has no motivation except the good is trying to argue that none of these reasons are there. The good man does not choose what he chooses because he has no external motivation, but because he is full of all sorts of proper motivations. Hector stands out because he thinks with the full scope of motivations. He recognizes the good as the source of each proper desire and acts accordingly. That is what it means to seek out the good. However, an objection against the validity or worth of Hector's sacrifice can be raised. Could not Hector have acted the way he did solely for his own personal peace, rather than also for the sakes of his family and countrymen? Looking at the story again, this position does appear to be possible. Hector certainly had reason to fear pursuing Helen, for what might his wife say? He may only have defended the city in order to remain in good standing with the people, to avoid falling to the popularity level of his brother, Paris. If Hector acted with no one but himself in mind, his decisions cease to be moving, and he himself no longer holds any great meaningful character. There is nothing special about just another undercover Paris. Yet Hector, though certainly aware of the potential repercussions to himself from his decisions, acts the way he does because of those whom a solely self-centered choice would physically and morally destroy. He knows he has duties toward his comrades and family, and that these relationships would not function right if he were to disregard these duties. He cannot have true feelings for his comrades or family that last if it is true that he is constantly calculating for only himself at the same time. Hector demonstrates true nobility by seeking the good. He shows through his actions that the good man is known by the many good motivations which he lives by. A second character, Penelope, demonstrates nobility by remaining faithful to her husband Odysseus during his absence of 20 years. Odysseus is called away to fight in the war against Paris for the return of Helen, and does not return year after year. Penelope has heard no word of whether he is living or dead, but she never gives up the hope that he might still be alive. Meanwhile, many brazen young men have come to court her for her beauty and her husband's great wealth, for they believe Odysseus to be either dead or hopelessly lost. They eat and drink away his wine and cattle, living uninvited in idleness and luxury off the work and struggle of another, whom they mock and boast against. They sleep with the loose maids of the house in the presence of the woman whom they supposedly court. Yet how can they be wrong in acting this way, unless there is truly a behavior required of them beyond any societal standards? Penelope ought still to give their offer of marriage serious thought if there really is nothing else. But Penelope does not see such a union as worthy of consideration, however serious might be the material consequences to her and her son if she does not accept the suitor's courtship. For she, like Hector, has chosen those motivations which will draw her toward the good, rather than draw her entirely into herself. She wants to remain true to her proven identity as the wife of Odysseus, the mother of his son. She is wasted for longing for Odysseus, while here they press for marriage. How can they talk of marriage, she says, as if I could ever forget Odysseus? Penelope holds out against the suitors long enough for her husband to return and to save her and their son. She could have been excused for remarrying, despite the chance her husband might make it home. Yet she waits for her husband. But what is her motivation for remaining true to Odysseus? What makes her desire to be the wife of one man her entire life? It calls to mind the scenario of the Lotus Eaters, men from Odysseus' crew who eat of a fruit which makes them happy, but also makes them forget who they are. Penelope is the wife of Odysseus, the mother of his son. Is she going to remember who she is? And what is the benefit to remembering one's history, remembering one's identity, and holding on to who one is in the good? It is that her motivations are the proper ones, namely a proper love for who she is, and the desire to go through life, staying true to her identity, to her history, to those she loves. And that will be very rewarding. For when Odysseus does return, she is so glad to have him back again. This truly is the reward of a faithful wife, that her husband has returned and he loves her deeply. If she had remarried some suitor right then, she would most likely have gotten someone who wanted to marry her only because she was rich. There is a mountain of motivation that she has to do the right, but she has to love the good. She has to love the highest things, which are what truly form the heart into desiring after what is truly good. She can see the good because man is made in the image of God, and so he has the natural law written on his heart. Man is therefore drawn by this knowledge of the good to seek it and delight in it, for he is drawn back to his Creator, who is the good itself. The reason desire to find the good is now so weak in man is because he is broken. Man is a glorious creature who has a vision for what is true and beautiful, and yet he is fallen and broken, so that his understanding of it becomes obscure and confused. Penelope, though her vision of the good is muddied by her sin, remains true to her husband and to herself, and the great beauty of morality is shown in that choice. Another individual who shows the beauty of man's vision for the good is Patroclus, the close friend of Achilles. The champion warrior Achilles and Agamemnon, the king of the Argives, enter into a dispute with one another. The quarrel progresses so far that Achilles actually threatens to sail for home. By declaring that he will leave, Achilles is ensuring the war will not end well for the Argives, where his presence decides whether they win or lose. He then asks his friend Patroclus if he will come with him when he departs. Patroclus is in a difficult position. Should he yield to his friend and abandon his comrades? Or should he stay true to the other soldiers and lose his closest friend? Patroclus knows that if he says yes to Achilles, Achilles will leave for certain, while if he says no, Achilles may possibly change his mind and stay. He also knows that he cannot simply walk out on either his comrades or his friend. He cannot bear to see those whom he knows dying all around him, so he decides that if Achilles will not do anything to help them, he must do something himself. He says to Achilles, "Give me your own fine armor to buckle on my back, so that the Trojans might take me for you, Achilles, and Aeneas' fighting sons get a second wind, exhausted as they are." Achilles finds this a good compromise between saving the Argives, while not giving ground to Agamemnon, and readily agrees. It is not until after Patroclus is slain that Achilles' eyes are fully opened to the risk that Patroclus was willing to take for the lives of others. For Hector mistakes Patroclus for Achilles, singles him out, and kills him, because he knows that the war will not last long once he or Achilles has died. Patroclus is paying a dear price for not answering Achilles with a yes, and Achilles knows it, though he does not truly consider its weight until after Patroclus' death. By turning down a chance to return home, Patroclus risks never seeing his country or family again, close people and places which he has not laid eyes on for over 9 years. Instead, had he lived, he would now continue to face death perpetually every day, like the rest of the soldiers. But would not any of them leap at the chance to return home? And yet Patroclus does not base his actions on how everyone else would act in the same situation. Had he followed what he felt the strongest, he might very well have ended up leaving with Achilles. But he had chosen his motivations carefully, because he desired the good. He desired the good not only for his own benefit, but because it was the only way he could truly love and serve those around him. Rather than following his immediate desire to return to the safety of his home, he chooses rather the fidelity to his friend and to his comrades. He sees that object, rather than immediate security, as the higher good. He could easily have reasoned that he ought to return home, for his parents' sake, and for all those he knew there who feared his death, but it must mean he would walk away from those to whom he owed the camaraderie of many years fighting for each other's sakes. That is really his central motivation. He sees his comrades are dying, and he has compassion on them. It calls to mind the scene when Eurypylus comes in with an arrow in his thigh, and Patroclus stops and bandages it up for him. His one thought is, my friends are dying. He cares about people, and that is a beautiful sight. He had not failed them yet. He would not desert them now, when they most need one another's company to survive. If he could just get himself to forget his friends, he could very simply have left them and gone to safety and peace, sorry that he must leave them, but glad at returning home. For Patroclus, however, there would be no gladness in returning home, for all the joys there would be overshadowed with the knowledge that he had left his comrades to die by allowing Achilles to return home, an event he might still have prevented had he stayed. Patroclus knows the deep worth of human loyalty. He lays hold of and delights in loyalty to his comrades. That is from the God-made human heart and is man's humanity. God has given this beautiful truth to man. Patroclus shows just how much man's image of God allows him to grasp that good and makes it so evident to him, even though he is sinful. His actions are not just examples of self-sacrifice. They are not only forsaking something, but laying hold of good. He realized that the highest personal interest is laying hold of those things that man knows to be noble and true, and is the highest aspiration of man's human nature. He sacrifices his safety to lay hold of loyalty because he seeks and loves the good. He gave up what was empty for that which is full. Patroclus' life points to the higher good through his love of the good in so many aspects of his life. A final character that demonstrates the existence of the higher good is Huckleberry Finn. Huck is traveling down the river to avoid being locked up and potentially murdered by his inebriated father. Jim is Huckleberry's traveling companion, an escaped slave seeking his freedom to avoid being permanently separated from his wife and children by being sold. Huckleberry Finn never demonstrates that consistent nobility displayed by Hector, Penelope, or Patroclus. Though he makes risks to his personal safety to help others at select times, he is never in any serious physical danger by his own will. Yet his flaws allow his single significant action to prove an important point. He has been taught that there is a life to come after the physical, and that all people spend it in either heaven or Hades, in eternal peace or eternal torment. He also has been taught, as part of his somewhat incomplete theology, that to help a slave successfully escape captivity would result in the helper being sent to hell. This teaching, which he does not doubt in the least, dawns on Huck after he rides the raft downstream with his coarse friend, a runaway slave. Huck fears for his soul. If he sees Jim safely to freedom, how can he possibly atone for his sin? The only way would be to turn Jim in instead, and this, much as he cares for Jim, he decides to do. Then Huck thinks of all that Jim has done for him as a friend. He recalls the many ways Jim has cared for him. his resolve is broken, and his heart is once more in turmoil. Finally, he decides and says, "All right, I'll go to hell." He fully believes that he is down, and yet he still does what he knows is right. He will not betray his friend to save himself. In all the other situations, he would only help if he could get away without being harmed. But in this case, he cannot help and come out unscathed. This example is a demonstration that conscience is not just a result of man's environment or what he has been taught. Conscience is an acknowledgement of and prompting of obedience to the higher good, seen clearly and apart from what they may have been taught. A healthy conscience comes from proper motivations, while immoral motivations cause the conscience to become diseased, though the conscience can never fully be eradicated. Motivations or desires are thrust upon every person, but each person must decide which desires they will pursue. Huckleberry Finn, though his conscience is sickly, still does what is right when it matters most, because even he has a notion of the motivation and beauty of loyalty, like Patroclus, Penelope, and Hector. The characters presented above each appear to make a difficult sacrifice, which cannot gain them anything close to the price they pay. This is, however, not exactly true, for they are not sacrificing what they really want. The helepa ta yala, or the good and beautiful things, are difficult to attain. They understand that the price demanded of them is not worthy of being compared with what they receive. For what they really want is to be good. What they truly desire is nobility, and there is nothing else which can feed and nourish the soul. Paris is going to have an empty soul. At the end of life, he finishes with just a pocket full of sand, for he has led a meaningless existence. That is the greatest grief that a human being can come to. For desires and motivations are not worth pursuing in and of themselves. They must have a fount from which they spring and which they necessarily lead back to. If they spring from life, they lead to life, and if they spring from death, they lead only to death. The life of the good is the best life one can possibly have because there is no real life elsewhere. The good is shown to be the food of the human soul, which is so obvious to man that he cannot live without it. Each day, he wakes up to participate in it. And anyone who claims that the moral vision is not evident to every human being has no concept of what it means to be human. The better a man becomes, the more he knows that what he desires is the good. And that is what makes his life beautiful. So enjoy the good. The good is a very good life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chabot. The image that kept on coming to me while I read your paper is those salmon that swim upstream, lay their eggs, and die. And, you think about those salmon and say, what's in it for them? They work so hard swimming up these rivers, they're jumping up these amazing waterfalls, dodging the bears. And what's the end of the journey? The goal is simply to lay eggs and then die. Well, it seemed like this is a very powerful instinct. And, there's all these incredible stories about salmon going through all these crazy avenues and little streams to find their original place of spawning so they can get back to it. And it seemed like a completely self-destructive goal or instinct. And so oftentimes when people, so my question is, how much is morality like a self-destructive instinct, which basically has nothing to do with ourselves? It's just something we pursue outside of the particular goals we might have for our own preservation. And so oftentimes when people talk about morality, they say, well, what's in it for me? Should I do the right thing? Well, what's in it for me? Okay, should I send my mother a Mother's Day note? Should I send her a Mother's Day card? Well, what's in it for me? Well, my mom will like me. and I'll feel good about myself. And so we tend to justify morality in terms of some sort of self-beneficial thing. And de Tocqueville says this is a particularly American characteristic. Americans just always like to be able to say, we never do the right thing just because it's the right thing. We're doing it because, really it's to our benefit. And sometimes, he seems to say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, not really believing the Americans, kind of a cute observation about a curious tendency of theirs. So how much would you say morality simply stands outside of all the other practical considerations of life? That morality is something that stands in its rationale, you might say completely outside of our usual structure of self-motivations, desire for self-preservation, and desire for self-benefit. Is it like that sort of salmon has this sort of self-destructive instinct for which all of life aims?
It is odd because with morality, it seems the only way to find fulfillment is to give up everything for other people, for the sake of other people. And it really does go against the whole idea of, I'm going to try to keep myself safe. I'm not going to go out. I suppose there's always the Achilles sort of idea where, even if I die, I'll be remembered. But there are cases where, there's no, everyone is against the person, and they still go, I'm going to just hold fast to whatever this is I'm upholding. And they don't get anything out of it here. And sometimes they're killed, or they die lonely. There's no one left that agrees or is with them. But they're holding up something they know is valuable and right and true. So yes, it is sort of like the salmon, in a sense. But they've achieved their aim, and they found good.
Immanuel Kant, when he talks about morality, is very strongly set against heteronomy, being ruled by something else besides our moral inclination. And he says every time when we try to explain morality in terms of our own self-benefit, you'll like yourself more, people will think well of you, you'll live in glory forever after you die. Every time we give a reason for morality, except the mere case that morality is what is right, what is our duty, that it corrupts morality. And how much would you agree with Kant in that? That insofar as we approach morality with anything except the rationale that it is done because it is the moral thing to do, no other consideration, that we fundamentally corrupt our own moral sensibility.
Yeah, if you stuff too many extra things in there, then eventually, why are you doing it? Oh, I'm doing it for myself. Okay. Well, that kind of takes that takes what is beautiful in morality out of it, and so then you're left with like you're half-baked, whatever. It's not. You see morality. Or you read about some sort of moral action or something someone did, and you see. Well, what makes it beautiful is if they were thinking about more than just themselves. Yes, the only way to have oneself fulfilled is to seek morality, just to seek the good, but you can't actually be seeking the good and trying to become a better person and also fully go after some of these other things. Like, I'll be liked more. Well, when it comes, yes, you can do that, but when it comes down to it in the end, there's going to be, the whole point is to prepare yourself for a situation where, you're not going to be liked. Are you still going to do what you know is right? Are you doing it only because you have external benefits? Or are you doing it because you know it's true? And it's what you have to do, and what you ultimately should want to do.
Yeah, it seems oftentimes when we try to explain morality to people, we come back to self-motivation, self-interest. Oh, you don't think you should do it to be moral? Well, let me just explain to you, this is going to make your life so great by doing this. And you seem to be arguing that there is something fundamentally different in morality where we don't have to do that. And yet I was thinking, what if you had some other cause that really did not involve our self-interest? Kind of silly example, but somebody says, you know what? We need to write poetry on the sand on the surface of the moon. All right? We need to send people to the surface of the moon and have them, write poems in the sand on the surface of the moon. And you say, well, why should I do that? Well, it's precisely because it has no benefit to you at all. It's just some other cause. It has no benefit to us. And when I present that to you on the basis that you should do it precisely because it's outside of your personal benefit, it's totally disconnected from anything that could possibly ever benefit you. Why is morality not like that? You think about writing verses on the surface of the moon, and you think, why would I do that? It doesn't benefit me. And yet with morality, you come down to the point and say, well, fundamentally, the point of being moral is not about it benefiting you. And why don't you just stop and say, well, why would I do that?
Because it benefits you and it doesn't benefit you. So, as far as your material possessions or your societal status or in those categories, sometimes it'll benefit you, and many times it will not. But it changes who you are. Now, Christians believe that if there is a life after death, and you live for God to give Him glory in this life, not because it's going to get you to that next life, but out of gratitude to Him for what He's done, for sacrificing Himself and rising again, so that we can spend eternity with Him in heaven. But even that aside, if you were to just look at morality, you go, oh, there's no afterlife. I'm not sure what other reason you could give for why it fulfills, but it does fulfill. To pursue nobility and good is the only thing that does fulfill a person ultimately. This is the sort of life. This is the only life that you're on your deathbed and you go, I have no regrets. I've tried, and I've done what I know is true and moral and honest, and I've screwed up a lot of times, but I've sought this for as long as I fully understood its value, and I know it was worth it.
Thank you very much. Could you just explain quickly for us? You had three different characters and four different characters, and each of these characters you're developing a picture of to illustrate some aspect of kind of the vividness of the moral imperative, the vividness of why morality is an end in itself. And could you just quickly kind of tick through those and explain what we're getting from each of those characters?
Sure. So I've got Hector, Penelope, Patroclus, and Huck. So for Hector, I mean they all share basically the same thing. I was more pulling out different points to kind of assign to them. So for Hector, I began with the fact that it's motivations. It's not just you either have desires, you don't have desires, and if you have desires, you won't get to the good, and if you have no desires, you'll get there. So I was trying to clear that up and say that it's because Hector has desires, but that he attains or pursues the good, but they're not just any desires, because there's some desires that will take you there, and there's other desires that will lead you away. And so, in that, with Hector, I was trying to show that it is the good desires that he pursues that make him choose nobility. And for Penelope is the idea that it's not, again, there's motivations, but there's also an aspect of it where there is a part of you that is good. That part that God, that image of God in us, who we are in the good, and how if we pursue the good, that part of us grows. And we remember. All of these characters, if they remember, they choose what they know is right. Hector remembers his family. Penelope remembers her family. Patroclus remembers his comrades and his friend. And Huck remembers his friend. And if they could just forget who they are in relation to all these people, they could have done whatever their impulse might have been, and felt fine, and have been fine, and would not have suffered in the least. But they know, and they remember those people around them, and they choose to remember, and because they choose to remember, they pursue the good, because they cannot remember and choose something else. And then for Patroclus, just as care for other people, the idea of loyalty again. And then for Huckleberry Finn, the notion that society makes the conscience. You're born, you're raised. I think Freud talked about this a bit. You're born, your conscience is formed by your parents and by society. Voila, you have your conscience. And so this is an example. Granted, they're all fictitious, but they're written by real people with the knowledge that other real people are going to read this and relate to it. Who's this fictional character? He realizes, hey, I've been taught this, that anyone who were to help a slave would get sent to hell, because I know, it's wrong. So, but I'm helping a slave. So, am I going to do what I've been taught, which I know I'll get kudos when I go to heaven for having done it, or am I going to, he's going after that, and then he goes, but I can't just betray my friend for my own benefit. He's lied to a lot of people in the book he's from, just kind of to get out of things, and nothing bad really happened, etc. But now he's faced with, am I going to choose to help my friend? Because so he goes against what he's been taught, and he knows that to give for his own You know, he wants to go to heaven. He doesn't want to go to hell. No one wants to go to hell. But he knows he can't just. He knows there's something wrong with, I'm going to choose this, and I'm going to betray my friend and turn him in, and then, so that I can get this. He knows there's something inherently wrong with that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chabot. Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that was a really interesting paper. Throughout, I couldn't help but think that when we read The Abolition of Man, Lewis kind of approached very similar ideas about having, like how being moral and achieving these good actions, it's important to have your sentiments properly trained and brought up. Were you kind of surprised? Like, did you notice sort of similarities when you read this and you're like, oh, it's kind of like my paper? Or did that kind of not really seem like, I don't know, did you find it funny that you two are writing about very similar things?
Actually, Mr. Hendricks warned me in my paper conference, hey, we haven't read Abolition of Man yet, might want to wait. And I didn't. So, yeah, I read the book, and the paper was already written. So.
All right.
But yes, Sarah.
That really paper, you read that really well. My question is, if a life in pursuit of the good is the only life which attains fulfillment, can it not be said to be a selfish pursuit because you are pursuing the only true fulfillment that you can have by pursuing the good?
In a sense, yes. But there's also, so yes, there is that side of it, and that side will always be there. So, with Patroclus, he knows, so yes, there is fulfillment. And that's part of, God has told us to enjoy life, and this is part of that. But I don't know if you remember, I reminded that Patroclus does not choose the good simply because he's going to be fulfilled by it. He chooses it because it's the only way he can actually serve those around him. And you can't have, there's no other way to keep himself from getting in the way than by pursuing the good. He himself would always, without that compass, he would always have that sort of selfish part that would push in and not allow him to serve his comrades the best way he could. So, yes, Adam.
First off, I enjoyed your paper a lot. To piggyback off of Sarah's question, does it matter then why someone pursues the good? So you say that there are people like Hector who pursue the good for the good's sake. And conversely, if the good is the only thing which is fulfilling, someone could in theory pursue the good because it fulfills them. Does it matter whether one pursues the good solely for the good or for self-fulfillment?
If you pursue the good solely for self-fulfillment, you are pursuing the good. So then you're, you have to have a mix of all of those in order to actually pursue the good. Because if you pursue it, if you go, oh, I want to find what's going, I'm focused on myself, so I'm going to go find, oh, it looks like the good is what's going to fulfill me. But then the good requires you to not be focused on yourself. To not focus on yourself will give you the, not like, oh, I'm not going to think about myself anymore. But a part of that is to focus and help other people and to think about more than just yourself. You have to have that if you pursue the good. To pursue the good is to do that. And you can't have the good or pursue it without giving up, in a sense, your own you give up your desire to be fulfilled, in a sense. Yes.
Okay, so is your idea of the good closer to Kant or to Aristotle?
Can you remind me what Aristotle says? I have to admit that Aristotle was one
In
of
the virtues, how he says that the virtues, what makes it a virtue is that you pursue it because it is the good.
I would say than Aristotle.
Okay.
Because
So
Kant is more of this idea that there's no motivation other than just this sort of idea of the good. But all these characters, especially the first two, they have all of these motivations that are solid and very, very evident. And to say, oh, they were just pursuing the good, what about this, and this, and this? So, like,
so for like a plant, water is the good, right? And it fulfills it, it sustains it, and it gives it life. So if that's what the good is, how could it be anything other than for yourself? I mean, it doesn't mean that you're hurting anyone by fulfilling, receiving, or seeking the good. The good edifies you, the good sustains you, and the good makes you a better person. So in seeking it, isn't it for yourself?
yes, it is. You do become a better person, and then again, God has called us to enjoy life, and part of that is to pursue the good, is to enjoy life. I forget what Mr. Hendricks was saying, because I forget what he was saying. It was something about how being addicted to life, and not just of being a stoic or abstaining. I don't eat. I don't eat sweet things, or I don't eat tasty things because that's kind of like Plato. I don't want to have anything to do with this world because it's the body, and the body's awful, and I want to get to the higher realm. But to pursue the good does mean to take part in life and to enjoy it. So, thank you. Yes, Mr. Mix.
Yeah, just to give a contrast to the picture that you're developing, I always like the image of the lifetime pass to Disneyland. Why would you do something? Because you'll get a lifetime pass to Disneyland with 24/7 food tickets, and you can spend the rest of your life at Disneyland. And I mean, Disneyland seems a pretty good place that serves our pleasures. I mean, it is there to serve us, to give us all the entertainment, all the diversion that we could possibly want. And so I think it's pretty easy to see that, saying that I'm going to be moral because I'm going to get the lifetime pass to Disneyland is a pretty, that vision falls apart pretty fast. You realize, oh, lifetime at Disneyland? Okay, I'll be 350 pounds in 6 weeks. And, this is not life. This is a cessation of life. And so it's very easy to see that sort of heteronomy, that sort of motivation to say you're going to be moral because you're going to get the lifetime ticket to Disneyland. It's easy to see that falls apart. And yet, coming back to the salmon motivation, I mean, you go to a salmon and you say, hey, lifetime pass to Disneyland. You don't want to swim up that stream. And the salmon goes, yeah, let's go to Disneyland. You see that salmon saying, no, you know what? I got to drive myself up here. I got to be a salmon. I got to get up that stream. I'm going to totally deplete my body of every last cell of fat on it. And by the time I get there, I'll be so exhausted. I will do my salmon thing. I will lay those eggs and die. And yet, it seems like the one answer you could give to that, you try to say, oh no, we don't live for something that's besides, the Disneyland vision. We live for something that's inherently not our self-interest, is to look at Mr. Salmon and say, Mr. Salmon, you like it though. I mean, when you swim up that stream, you get there and you lay those eggs. It's not a moment of self-sacrifice. That's what you enjoy. And so, you know what, Mr. Salmon, even you are living a life of selfishness. because ultimately it's the pleasure of completing that task that you live for. And so it is all about pleasure. Well, my question comes down to, can you reduce the moral life in the same way? To say, okay, sure, I admit any human being who's over 5 years old knows lifetime pass to Disneyland is an inferior vision of life. But the moral life, the life of moral vision, the life of self-sacrifice, ultimately is just as selfish, because when you grow up, you realize that is pleasurable. Living a moral life is, attaining the good. And that is basically, for human beings, what our greatest pleasure is, to be able to say, we lived our life well. And so, can you still explain the pursuit of morality, even if it's for morality itself, simply on the pleasure principle, that ultimately, yes, even you, the moral person, the moral grown-up, you're just seeking your pleasure, because this is the pleasure of human life, to live moral.
Well, let's see, what was it I had? Yeah, my concluding paragraph, they're sacrificing for the sake of something else. They're not sacrificing for the sake of sacrificing. If someone goes and, I think it was in Tolstoy, War and Peace, there's this one guy, he's really young, and he gets, he goes and enlists in the army, and he's in the cavalry, I think, and he wants to, he wants to die for his country, and
Calling it.
yes. So he doesn't even get to the idea of why. He just, I'm gonna die for my country because, period. And so his officers keep seeing him ride by he'll go right up to the enemies when he's really close, he'll pull his pistol and, fire a shot, and they're like, what are you doing? This is stupid. You're going to die, and, what for? And that eventually is what happens, he does get killed. So the idea that we know there's something wrong when someone is going out and, they just die, and they meant to die. They weren't trying to escape something. They were kind of trying to get something maybe, but they just die. And we know there's something wrong with that, because the person who dies for what is right, we acknowledge that that was they were trying to get somewhere. So yes, it is. I guess you could say pleasure principle, but again, it's not. You can't actually pursue the good solely for yourself, because that's not how the good can be pursued. It's
The reason I bring it up is, it seems like if you acknowledge that both of them are really just kind of examples of the pleasure principle, it seems that somebody can come along and say, hey, you think you're living for this self-sacrifice thing, gonna give it all up to lay the little salmon babies, but things are a lot simpler. You could realize, if you just realize your pleasure could be had at Disneyland, and if you just get rid of all that sort of responsibility stuff, you get the ticket to Disneyland, and you can start living that pleasure today and forego all this kind of rigorous pleasure and go to, Candyland pleasure.
So that brings us back to the idea of the Lotus Leaders. Are you going to remember who you are? And are you going to just forget and, they're sitting on an island eating this fruit, juice everywhere, is kind of lolling all over the place, and Odysseus is going, come on, we're trying to get home. And they can't even remember what home is, or why they're supposed to be getting there. And there is a difference. So there's pleasure, and then, but is there really an end in sight? Is there something that's being pursued? If you look at Paris and Helen, they want pleasure. They're big about pleasure, but they're trying to pursue something, and they're never fulfilled. Helen keeps hopping from one guy to the next. When Paris dies, she finds someone else. She only returns to Menelaus because Menelaus conquered the city, for crying out loud, and carried her off. They're seeking for something. They're looking for something, and they can't find it. And you know, someone like Hector, or Penelope, or Patroclus, they found it, and that's what they're living for. That's what they're trying to get to. They have the goal. The goal is the good. And you look at all these other characters, Paris and Helen are so disgusted because they're just for whatever comes next. They're looking for, well, they're not looking really. They're just kind of, you know, oh, I want that, I want that, I want that. They're not, you know, pulling out their telescope and going, okay, where am I headed? What is the ultimate goal? And so yes, there's definitely pleasure associated with the pursuit of the good. Also a lot more pain than some of the other lives, but there is a fulfillment that cannot be found anywhere else. It can be found temporarily, but ultimately, Paris on his deathbed is probably going, shoot, I wonder what happens next. I don't know. And he knows that then you got Hector. He's pursued this truth, and his life has had purpose in that. And he goes, whatever comes next, I've done what I was supposed to, and I've done what I can, and I've aimed for this truth that I know. Now, of course, you've got all these people that, you know, you say, oh, Plato found what he was looking for. And that's kind of why the Christian life, with the knowledge that there is a life to come, is ultimately what truly fulfills after death. But throughout this life, this is the only thing that actually has an endpoint, the pursuit of the good. Because none of all these other places, they're just going around and around and around and around, and they never get to the end. And these people that we read about, we go, you know, they've got something there. They've found what that end is.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chabot.